Another year, another Battlefield game. And like all the Battlefield games before it, Battlefield 5 is shaping up to have an awesome PC version. Powered by the ever-impressive flexible Frostbite engine, Battlefield 5 is looking to push out ever more striking visuals than its predecessors, and I must say, even in this early preview on PC, this is already one handsome looking alpha product as it looks so far. Though as outstanding as it may be visually, it is still an alpha of course, and that does show in some areas. Still, the PC alpha gives us a nice preview of the graphical makeup of the game coming out on October 19th, what we can most likely expect in performance, and really importantly what we as testers should be giving as feedback. But being just a preview of the closed alpha product, and limited to one really snowy map, we cannot make too many assumptions here. But that being said, let's dive in and have a look at what's in front of us. My first impression of the beta so far is, wow, this is one really pretty game. For various reasons, I had kind of been avoiding the Battlefield games for a while now, so I had partially forgotten how utterly wonderful the Frostbite engine is for rendering these kind of multiplayer worlds. You click spawn on a capture point and zoom! The camera slickly moves down from the overhead map view directly into your character view, showing off this immense scale and impressive on-the-fly handling of LODs in the process. For an alpha product, this looks and feels already really polished because of things like that. And as soon as you enter that first-person view, I at least was generally floored by the rendering of the immediate surroundings, in particular the snow-swept Norwegian landscape here. There's just so much multiplayer mayhem going around everywhere, and it's in this gorgeously photorealistically rendered environment. And as silly as it sounds, I actually think the graphical grandeur of the alpha can be summed up by looking at something as simple as the snow itself, and snow is really all we have to work with right now since there's only one map. But like every aspect of the rendering in the game, and there are many aspects of rendering here, the snow subtly combines a whole suite of impressive and artfully employed rendering features which just make it look so darn good. See, snow in reality of course is made up of a bunch of extremely small structures and facets, ice spits and surfaces, which are in fact so much smaller than a pixel on your monitor would ever really be. This structure then causes macro and micro shading properties that are not easy to represent with the normal shading model you see on hard surfaces, like guns or brick. For example, those tiny facets of ice that make up snow make it so that light flares and sparkles across its surface, regardless of distance. So artfully, DICE here has replicated that sparkle with a specific shader effect which is not driven by a texture seemingly, and changes based upon your distance to the surface. Here you can see how the surface stays sparkly and detailed regardless of how close you are to it, and doesn't suffer from any patterns or repeating forms. Such tiny and shiny sparkles seen further away from the camera in games are usually removed because they would cause aliasing or firefly flashes, but not with this technique here, and it looks really good. Snow rendering also highlights another great rendering feature present in Battlefield 5's alpha. Like the games before it, Battlefield 5 looks to be using Geomeric's enlightened global illumination technology, which adds that extra layer of believability to the corners and crevices found in the game world. Notice here the lit area near the shadow shows local light bounce from the sun in the shadowed region, while the areas adjacent to it do not. That means the global illumination here actually shows directionality and locality of where the sun's light is hitting the surface, so it's real bounce. Something that other coarser global illumination systems do not necessarily handle so well. And this is all in a multiplayer shooter. But yeah, snow again. I'm gonna keep talking about snow. Snow is of course not a completely opaque surface like other wonderfully represented surfaces in the game such as metal or wood. And DICE here looks to have implemented a rather convincing subsurface scattering effect that softens the harshness of shadows and light cast across its surface, as you can see here. Look how the snow here, being rendered with the specific snow shader, has a much softer shadow cascade on it than the surrounding surfaces. Or look how the transition in the snow region showcases some realistic light leakage, with it not just being the same uniform ambient shaded color. It really gives the snow that powdery semi-transparent look that your eye really expects. And just when you thought I would stop talking about snow, well, its contours and shapes highlight one of Frostbite's incredible strengths and advantages in rendering, which makes a welcomed return here in Battlefield 5. Notice how the snow is bumpy, irregular, yet highly detailed. Since the first Battlefront game on Frostbite, DICE has been using displacement-based GPU tessellation to render a lot of the ground surfaces in its games, and I definitely think that shines best in Battlefield 5 so far. At the moment, I could definitely say there's probably no other game which so seamlessly uses GPU tessellated surfaces to such a universal degree. It's everywhere in this Norway map. Just look at how fantastic these rocks look here, for example. And if that was not enough, this bumpy surface of the snow is not completely static. Here you can see how character movement and footsteps leave impressions in the snow, or how tank treads leave deep geometric impressions themselves, or even how grenades, artillery, and explosions leave craters or divots in the ground. And speaking of wanton destruction, well, I'm pretty sure everyone will be happy to know that the buildings in the game, such as houses and the general play area, look to be rather destructible this time. Much more akin to Battlefield Bad Company 2 than Battlefield 4 or Battlefield 3. I have yet to see a house collapse in on itself like the good old days, but the play area of the level looks to be rather dynamic this time around, and more so than I actually remember. But for that, we'll save that for the real review of the game come October. So remember, soldier, concealment is not cover. The last aspect rounding out the rendering of the snow comes from the awesome GPU-driven particle effects. Frostbite has been using GPU-driven particles since at least 2015 with Battlefront, but the artistry and subtlety of their usage in Battlefield 5 is really quite impressive. Notice how in this scene here that the flurries of snow cascade over the ridgeline, flowing downward and running over the ground. Or here in this scene, how they bounce around the inside of this bombed out house, getting stuck in corners and rebounding off dynamic objects like characters. In other games that use GPU particles, they can be just thrown around everywhere with little respect for realism due to their general cheap cost. But yeah, here in Battlefield 5, they're just rendered into the mix in a subtle enough way where they do not intrude and become obvious as to their nature. It just looks right, and they render enough particles so that it actually looks like what it's supposed to represent. The tech art team here deserves some specific praise for such great integration. But heck, it's a Battlefield game, and these games have always been technologically impressive showings, with every release going back to Battlefield 1942. Moving into other areas that are not snow, we are presented with that same exact technology as we have seen in other Frostbite games for a while now, like per object motion blur, camera motion blur, screen space ambient occlusion, or screen space reflections. These are of course all tweakable in the options menu, as we've come to expect of Frostbite games at this point. Given how the game is attempting to go for some sort of filmic presentation in some aspects, the default options also add in things like chromatic aberration, film grain, lens barrel distortion, and the like. Thankfully, these camera effects can be enabled and disabled in the menu, should you dislike them like I basically do. And like all DICE Battlefield games before, the game allows fine-grained control of things like FOV, and the individual presets from low, medium, high to ultra. But given the nascent version we have here, I think my breaking down the various presets and their effects on performance or visuals is a bit premature at this point. But for those who are curious, here's how they look at the moment. But still, as it has always been with DICE Frostbite games, I really imagine it will scale really well across different hardware, from low-end PCs, consoles, to ultra-high-end performance rigs. The options in the end will allow you to cut corners in many places to win back performance. As of this closed alpha, of course, it is running rather well, I think. Frostbite is pretty mature this late into the console generation, so most of its problems and kinks in its systems have been ironed out at this point. Though at the moment, the game is a bit heavy on Ultra, more than I expected to a certain degree. At 1440p Ultra on a rig containing a Ryzen 1700X and a GTX 1070, I was not able to get a locked 60 FPS due to the GPU limiting performance. Turning down to 1080p gave the GPU enough headroom to perform well above 60 in most areas. In the alpha at least, there were some views and circumstances that still saw presumably CPU-related drops under DX11 here. On the other hand, using an i5-8400 rig with either an RX 580 or an NVIDIA GTX 1060, it was possible to maintain a near 60 FPS at 1080p Ultra, but having expansive views dropping the frame rate below 60 on the CPU side, and alpha effects dropping the frame rate down on the GPU side. Turning down the presets to high saw that frame time staying below the 16.6 milliseconds required for a good solid 60 FPS for the most part. There were some occasional stutters here and there, but nothing too bad. And if it's like any DICE game before it, I expect CPU performance on the CPU side to be even better at release, either under DX11 or DX12 as it always seemingly is, and hopefully with the elimination of frame time spikes that I was occasionally seeing. So this is the state of things as they currently are in Battlefield 5. Frostbite is a mature engine, and the set of options DICE games have allowed since the start of this generation are also in a more mature state. Battlefield 5 on a technical level is an iterative product. And it shows, and that's not a bad thing. Given that it is an iteration, I think I should voice some feedback here about what things could change or be added to the PC version to really push it over the edge in the final product, so that it goes from being an iterative release to some great release and beyond our expectations. For example, I mentioned motion blur earlier. It's great that we have control over its strength. But following the line of reasoning I recently explained in our tech focus feature on motion blur, it would be great if we could have control over its strength for both camera motion blur and per object motion blur. I think a good number of players would enjoy to leave per object blur on in Battlefield 5 to highlight those awesome animations, but to turn off camera motion blur because it's a multiplayer shooter. Beyond that, I think there are a couple of other features more often found in the console versions of Frostbite games that should make their way over to PC and when done, be done correctly. Here I'm talking about dynamic resolution. Sure, it's not necessary, but as general feedback, it's a great option to have for those who want to maintain high graphical settings and sustain performance in the game at all times, utilizing their rig to the fullest. Here I think it would be great if the user, much like in Titanfall 2, could control the target frame rate, target resolution, as well as take advantage of a dynamic super sampling feature to go above the resolution targeted for when there's excess GPU resources left over. I think it's a great thing to have, and I would definitely take advantage of it were it to be there. And even though I don't think there's any realistic chance of this happening, it would be really great to also see a chance for users to take advantage of checkerboard rendering, which has been found in some console releases of Frostbite games. While checkerboard rendering is not exactly artifact-free and perfect, is definitely a great way for users of high-resolution sets to get acceptable image quality while not sacrificing too much performance to reach things like 4K. Having this as an option on top of dynamic resolution would be the icing on the cake of a great PC version, I think, and DICE generally makes really great PC versions. Lastly, there's the small thing of just getting rid of the double-layered approach to getting to the options menu. Hitting more and then clicking on options to be able to tweak the game is pretty silly. So that's it. Battlefield 5 currently looks like it will be an absolute visual treat on PC that offers good scaling, a wealth of options, and also looks to push the Frostbite engine to new heights. In subtle ways though. And given how the snow is rendered, I'm really curious to see what the other environments in the final game will look like and how I can tear them up. Hopefully the developers can hear the requests I made in this video and look to implement some of the changes that I really think would push the PC version into excellent territory, above and beyond previous outings on PC. Things like dynamic resolution and the ability to turn off camera motion blur separate from per object blur and checkerboard rendering would just be fantastic. What do you think? Are there any other technical changes you would like to see between the alpha and the release version of the game? Leave a comment below as I'm curious to hear your thoughts. But beyond that, thanks for taking the time to watch this video and endure my rusty Battlefield skills. If you did enjoy what you have watched, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell in the corner for notifications should you already be subscribed. If you want to talk with me about the technical side of the Battlefield 5 alpha, look to reach out to me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. As always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.